the 7th of November 2025, right? Okay, so what's in store for us today? Let's see. Now, today I'm talking about the Supreme Court appears skeptical of Trump's tariff. So what courts, traders, and markets are signaling? An introduction to the whole thing. The US Supreme Court has just heard oral arguments in Trump versus VOS Elections Incorporated, a case that could decide the fate of President Trump's sweeping reciprocal and fentanyl-related tariffs, and more broadly, how far any president can go in using emergency powers to reshape trade policy without Congress. Now, during more than 2.5 hours of arguments, justices across the ideological spectrum, including some of Trump's own appointees, repeatedly questioned whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a 1977 emergency powers statute, really allows the White House to impose broad, long-lasting tariffs on nearly all US trading partners. At stake is not only the legal foundation of Trump's signature economic policy, but also a potential massive tariff refund bill, variously estimated from tens of billions of dollars to as much as 750 billion to 1 trillion. If importers eventually claw back years of payments plus interest, Trump has called the case life or death for the United States. So what justices are saying and the counter arguments. Okay, so core legal action: can IEEPA be used as a general tariff weapon? Trump's position: the administration argues that IEEPA's language allow the president to regulate importation during a national emergency is broad enough to include tariff. They claim long-running trade tariffs deficits, and fentanyl trafficking constitute unusual and extraordinary threats that justify sweeping duties, including Liberation Day tariffs of 10 to 50% on imports from more than 150 countries. Now, Solicitor General D. John Sauer told the court that this fits with historical practice where Congress had at times delegated tariff adjustment powers to the president in response to foreign actions. Now, for the challengers counter case, small businesses and a coalition of states argue tariffs are a form of tax, and under the Constitution, the power to levy taxes, including tariffs, belong primarily to Congress rather than to the president. IEEPA was designed mainly for targeted sanctions and blocking transactions in national security crisis, not for re-engineering the entire US tariff schedule. So if IEEPA really allowed tariffs this broad, it would be a constitutional problem because Congress is not supposed to give the president unlimited tariff power based on vague wordings. Now, lower court have agreed with this logic, holding that Trump exceeds his authority under IEEPA and that using it as a catch-all tariff statutes either goes beyond the statute's text or would make it unconstitutional. So these were the thoughts from the bench. That means the judges. Okay, they are showing skeptical signals. Now, Chief Justice John Roberts: big policy, vague law. Roberts worried that such sweeping global tariffs are too big a policy to rest on IEEPA's vague wordings, hinting that Congress would need to speak much more clearly. Justice Neil Gorsuch: tariffs are Congress jobs. These are her thoughts. Gorsuch stressed that taxing people, including through tariffs, is mainly Congress's power, and questioned whether Congress really meant to hand such tariff authority to the president. Justice Amy Coney Barrett doubt on fits and wordings, but basically. So Barrett questioned whether worldwide tariffs match the specific emergencies Trump cited and noted that IEEPA talks about regulating imports, not explicitly about tariffs. Now, the three liberals clearly against Trump's reading, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, all signaled that they would like strike the tariffs, stressing that tariffs are taxes for Congress, that emergencies are being overused, and that IEEPA was meant to narrow, not expand emergency trade powers. Now, Justice Samuel Alito is the most supportive of Trump. Alito sounded more sympathetic to Trump, emphasizing the need for presidents to keep strong tools, including tariffs, to deal with foreign crisis. Now, Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas, uneasy but unclear. Kavanaugh questioned why no earlier president had used IEEPA this way if the power existed, yet worried about cutting back emergency tools. Thomas asked about major questions and non-delegation issues and floated extremely hypothetical but did not clearly show which way he'll vote. Okay, so the bottom line is this. Taken together, the questions from the judges, right? It suggests Trump may be well short of the 5 votes needed to fully preserve his tariff program, though how broad the final ruling will be is still uncertain. So when would we be getting the final ruling? This case has been put on an expedited track, so one can reasonably frame it as a ruling is expected before year end and possibly within weeks. So what prediction markets are saying on Kalshi, a predictive tool, contracts on how many injustice will vote for Trump tariffs now implies roughly 33% odds that the court ultimately upholds them, down from the 45 to 50 just before the hearing. Okay. On poly markets, a market on Supreme Court rules in favor of Trump tariffs has dropped into the low to mid 20-30% after the argument from more than 40% earlier this week. Okay, so both predictive markets are showing that Trump probably may lose and the tariffs will all be cancelled. So if court rules against Trump, here are the market scenarios. Scenario 1, reason relief rally, arguably the base case that we might see. So mechanics for an up move in the S&P 500. Now, cost relief and margin expansion. Retailers, automakers, industrials, and any firm that relies on imports will see the overall import costs fall as tariffs comes off. That improves profit margins and earnings expectation, especially for big multinationals and consumer goods companies. So we also have the disinflationary impulse. Tariffs are effectively a sales tax on imports. Removing them is at the margin disinflationary, which markets typically like because it can support real household purchasing power and strengthen the case for a more dovish Fed path at the margin, or at least ease some pressure on long-term interest rates. And there will, for the global trade and emerging markets optimism, a ruling striking down unilateral global tariffs is interpreted as the US stepping back from tariff escalation. That's bullish for global trade volume, emerging market exporters, and multinational earnings. Okay, so for the positioning and uncertainty premium, prediction markets already price a high chance for a loss for Trump, but not 100%. A clear decision could remove policy uncertainty, reduce the extra return investors' demand for taking risks, and giving indices a modest boost. So the probable short-term outcome, mildly bullish for broad US equities, with outperformance in global cyclicals like industrials, auto, machinery, consumer discretionary, and large retail change, multinationals with complex supply chains. Okay. For scenario 2, market pullback despite a win on tariffs, that also can happen. This is a credible path where stocks sell even though tariffs are struck down. Okay. So why could the ruling be resolved? Number 1, if we see this refund shock and deficit worries, this is the focus of the market. You know, the news, they come out very, very gloomy. Then you can see a market pullback. So it all depends on the narrative at that moment. So if court opinions is interpreted as entitling importers broadly to refunds, analysts will start modeling large potential repayments anywhere from tens of billions to hundreds of billions, and some commentators even float 750 billion to 1 trillion worst case exposures, right? That would raise question about how much debt the Treasury must sell, the size of the deficit, and how much extra interest investors will demand on long-term bonds. Higher yields would mechanically pressure equity valuations, especially for long-term duration, growth stocks. Now, and next is the hit to perceive US bargaining leverage. Okay, some investors may see tariffs as negotiating lever that force trading partners to the table. If that tool is removed without a clear replacement, markets could price in less US leverage in future trade disputes, amount negative for sectors competing with foreign producers. And sector-specific pain also could happen. Protected sectors such as steel, certain chemicals, and US manufacturers boosted by bring production home trend may be hurt if cheaper imports come back and competition intensifies. That could drag relevant cyclicals of small cap baskets even if the S&P 500 overall holds up. And the broader executive power chill narrative, if the ruling sharply limits presidential power, markets may start to fear that similar limits could hit other areas where presidents have acted aggressively, such as energy policy, tech rules, or sanctions. That could make investors uncertain about how quickly the government can react in future crises, and that kind of policy doubt usually leads to them to pay less for stocks. So the probable short-term outcome for this thing, choppy or modestly negative reaction, is plausible if market if like the market could be choppy or slip a bit, especially if the ruling strongly cuts back presidential powers and headlines focus on huge refunds, bigger deficits, and high interest rates. Okay, so lastly, the scenario for a muted two-way reaction. There's also possible that macro and Fed dynamics drown out the tariff ruling, especially if the decision is narrow. Example, limit some tariff application but leaves others or alternative authorities intact. Refunds are framed as procedural and gradual, with lawyer emphasizing that importers must file claims and but not all tariffs will be repaid automatically. By the time the ruling comes, markets are more focused on earnings, inflation, data, or Fed policy. So in this case, you likely see investors quickly sell shares in companies that were protected by tariffs and buy more of those that benefit from cheaper imports. But only a modest net move at the index level as investors treat the result as largely priced in. Okay, so these three scenarios could actually happen. So keep in mind and watch out when the ruling comes out. Now, I also like to tell you one thing. This morning, Trump tweeted that even if he fails in this, okay, he has plan B up his sleeve. But he has said he is not going to tell anyone what his plan B is until he needs to execute it. Okay, so we'll see what's next. With that, that's the report for today.